Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenAirsoft.com. I'm Owen McCallan, and today we're taking a look at a Toy-Tec Calico M100. Now you may not be familiar with Toy-Tec. They were a classic airsoft brand in the 1980s, primarily producing externally air-powered replicas, and this M100 was a licensed replica of a Calico M100 pistol, which they produced sometime in either 1987 or 1988, and this is probably the product that the company is best known for. Now, like most classic guns, this is externally powered, originally intended to be used with canned gas, but nowadays more commonly used with regulated CO2 or HPA. And I wanted to take a look at this because there are a couple of very interesting elements about this gun that set it apart from its more modern counterparts. So let's bring the camera in and take a look at what it is and how it works. Now, before we get into the individual parts of this gun, I want to point out a few things. First, like most classic guns, it's almost entirely plastic, although, unlike many, it does have some very prominent metal elements. There's a metal barrel, a metal charging handle, although this is just decorative, it doesn't do anything, and a metal trigger, but as is typical for most replicas of this area, it's predominantly plastic, with a plastic foregrip, plastic mock magazine release, we'll talk about that in a moment, mostly just a plastic gun. I also want to point out that down here we have a modern quick disconnect fitting to enable compatibility with modern HPA setups. This is not original to the gun, although this style of line is, as well as the fitting it uses to connect to the gun. Starting at the muzzle, we have what appears to be a machined aluminum piece, which connects to the receiver through a collar which retains the front folding grip. This just moves freely, there's no mechanism to hold it in place. As mentioned, we have a mock charging handle and a mock takedown screw, which is just molded directly in. The front sight block, which is plastic, although it does have a metal sight. This is in fact the only sight on the gun. Normally a longer Calico would have a front sight out at the front, or it might have a front sight and rear sight pair on the magazine, but on this one, we just have this one sight. Moving down to the trigger, this is, as mentioned, one of the metal parts on the gun. When the gun is set to safe, it can only move part of the way. When it's set to any of the fire settings, it's capable of moving quite a bit farther. This has 4 fire settings. We have safe, semi-auto, 3-round burst, and full auto. Yes, this does in fact have a burst mechanism. The grip is plastic and is a clamshell design. It looks like it has a metal retaining plate at the bottom, but that's just molded directly in. We have some markings, Calico and M100 22LR on the left side. More Calico M100 22LR on what would be the magazine. On the real gun, this is a helical magazine which separates from the gun and holds 100 rounds of 22LR. However, on this one, it's molded directly into the gun because this is actually a hopper. Magazine release tabs back here are purely decorative. If we flip over to the other side, we have a few more markings. Before using this air gun, read and follow the instructions. Born in Bakersfield, California, USA. Born in USA. Of course, they don't say made in USA because this is a replica, an officially licensed one at that. American Industries, which was Calico before they became Calico, or California Light Arms Corporation. More American Industries, and ASGK. And a serial number, which does appear to be unique to each gun. On the right side, we have actual markings for the selector, showing safe, single shot, 3-round burst, and full auto. Otherwise, more the same. Now, to talk a little bit about how this works, we've got to really examine that hopper. So this tab swings open, and that reveals an internal reservoir. If we turn this crank at the back, that actually pulls forward a follower, allowing the user to dump up to 1,000 BBs into this hopper, and once it's loaded, push the button on the back to release, and that applies tension. As the gun feeds, it has a revolving mechanism we'll take a look at in a moment inside, which feeds BBs from this hopper directly into the feed mechanism. There's no need to wind it up, it just keeps on going until it's out of ammo completely. Now let's start taking it apart. First things first, the outer barrel simply unscrews from the inner barrel. Or rather from the inner barrel section, because this is actually our inner barrel. This is just an aluminum piece of tubing. We're told that this is 6.1 millimeters, which was fairly tight at the time. Now we can remove the foregrip assembly with a Phillips head screw concealed in the block. That just comes right off, along with a retaining collar on the front. Now we can remove the rear sight by simply unscrewing it. And now the rest of the body is held together by a lot of clamshell screws. So let's start by removing the grip. Alright, now with all those screws removed, we can just start to pry it apart. As this comes apart, we just need to remove one securing tab from the back here, which is just a little tricky because of how it's pinched in place. There we go. And now, here are the inner workings of the Calico. So at the front, I could just pull out another section of the barrel. And this contains a forerunner to the modern hop-up bucking. This doesn't actually provide any hop, but it is a rubber tensioner of sorts to just prevent BBs from rolling down the barrel. Then we have our hopper system. Oh, remove the tab from the top. So, if we start winding this, you can see that it's just a section of steel cable, which pulls on a winch on this spring-loaded assembly. And when pushing the button in the back, it releases it, allowing it to snap forward. At the front, it's kind of hard to see, but there's an assembly similar to blades of a fan. To get a better look at that, let's actually take it apart a little bit further. So if I just take out one screw, then the entire functional mechanism comes out of the shell. I'll pry out the feed mechanism. So here you can see this is the hopper, and now this is the actual feed system of the gun. We have this helical assembly that is prevented from rotating backwards by a tab of spring steel, a little bit corroded on this example, and this is actuated by a lever on the right hand side. So every time this gets pushed up, it forces the wheel to spin. And that wheel is going to draw BBs in, and it's going to feed them down into this slot. Just brings them around and into the slot. This is actuated by the nozzle, which unfortunately we can't really show in live fire, but every time this nozzle comes forward, there's a tab that works as a trigger plate on the underside, and it pushes up on this little lever. So it's going to push that lever forwards, and that's going to come up, and this arm coming up is what actually drives the feed mechanism. So every time the nozzle comes forward to fire a shot, it rotates this assembly by one click to feed a single BB into this retention chamber, and then the nozzle coming forwards is what actually pushes that BB into the rubber gasket to chamber it and then fire around. So that is this silver tube. This is the actual pneumatic assembly. We're not going to take it apart, unfortunately, because it's very complicated internally. It's got a lot of old gaskets that I just don't want to mess with. But as it pressurizes, it pushes forwards on this sear lever, and then when this sear is allowed to snap backwards, that's what actually fires the gun. So that we might actually be able to demonstrate here. So now it's cocked, and if I pull the trigger, snaps back, and that's what actually fires it. That's controlled by the fire control mechanism in here, and not going to take this apart either. It's very delicate, very complicated. It took about 6 hours to get it back together the first time without any instructions on where the parts go after they exploded across the room. Not really keen to repeat that experience, but I can at least show there is a cam track on the back here, which is used for the burst mechanism, along with a cam system on the underside. And the fire selector up here functions by limiting both a disconnector lever, which is attached to this main sear connected to the trigger, and also operating on the burst mechanism down here. So the interplay of the burst cam and an auto sear to disable the disconnector is what controls the fire selection. It's a very, very complicated system with a lot of moving parts, but it does as advertised, providing safe semi-burst and full auto. And then the last piece of this complex mechanism is how the main sear actually releases gas. So we have a hook here on the main sear. You can see that when I pull the trigger, that gets pulled forwards a little. And that interacts with this gas system here. So when this is connected to a gas source, this entire unit is pressurized. And when the trigger is pulled, it pulls upwards on this piston, which is very hard to do by hand. But anyways, that releases gas to go through here and then up into the tubing and around to the engine itself. And that's really all there is to it. Some aspects of this are very complicated, like the fire control, which is all plastic but still manages to provide that burst-capable select fire, while other elements are very simple, like the way it mediates gas. And lastly, I mentioned that this is not the original inlet for gas, although it does use this style of line. The original line was actually included with this gun. It's just the same style of 6mm macro line that's used nowadays, but the gas system is completely different. This gets plugged in directly to the gun, and at the other end, it gets plugged into this funny adapter here. So standard macro line fitting plugs in. But then these two ports accept cans of external gas, which thread in from underneath, screw down. That punctures both cans simultaneously and provide power. I'm not going to demonstrate this because we actually do have some of the cans that were included with it. This is Flan 12, which, if you're not familiar, is more commonly known under the brand name of Freon. Not only is this an intensely ozone-depleting substance, it's also toxic for inhalation in any manner. This was packaged and sold alongside the gun. It produces a vapor pressure of 40 to 50 psi at room temperature thereabouts, so very weak stuff, and 2 cans were used simultaneously to improve vaporization of the propellant. But obviously this has gone away for good reason, and nowadays we use just HPA or CO2. Now, as far as classic guns go, this is a very sophisticated piece, and ultimately it wasn't actually competition from other classics that killed it, but rather in 1991 when Tokyo Marui unveiled the first AEG that was really the final nail in the coffin for the classic externally powered guns. Nowadays there's a bit of a resurgence, so maybe we'll see another Calico. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching. We're huge fans of Ian McCullum's work and the scholarly approach that he brings to the firearms community, and if you're living under a rock and have never heard of Forgotten Weapons, we highly suggest you go check out that channel. In the meantime, I think I need to find some 7.65 French long. And as always, thanks for watching.